Chapter 4 of Plunkitt of Tammany Hall, a series of very plain talks on very practical politics. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti. Plunkitt of Tammany Hall, a series of very plain talks on very practical politics by George Washington Plunkitt. Chapter 4. Reformers, only Mornin Glories. College professors and philosophers who go up in a balloon to think are always discussing the question why reform administrations never succeed themselves. The reason is plain to anybody who has learned the ABCs of politics. I can't tell you how many of these movements I've seen started in New York during my 40 years in politics, but I can tell you how many have lasted more than a few years. None. There have been reform committees of 50, of 60, of 70, of 100, and all sorts of numbers that started out to do up the regular political organizations. They were morning glories, looking lovely in the morning and withered up in a short time, while the regular machines went on flourishing forever, like fine old oaks. Say, that's the first poetry I ever worked off. Ain't it great? Just look back a few years. You remember the People's Municipal League that nominated Frank Scott for mayor in 1890? Do you remember the reformers that got up that league? Have you ever heard of them since? I haven't. Scott himself survived because he had always been a first-rate politician, but you'd have to look in the newspaper almanacs of 1891 to find out who made up the People's Municipal League. Oh, yes, I remember one name, Ollie Teal. Dear, pretty Ollie and his big dog. They're about all that's left of the league. Now take the reform movement of 1894. A lot of good politicians joined in that, the Republicans, the State Democrats, the Steckelites, and the O'Brienites, and they give us a licking. But the real reform part of the affair, the Committee of 70 that started the thing going, what's become of those reformers? What's become of Charles Stewart Smith? Where's Bangs? Do you ever hear of Cornell the Iron Man in politics now? Could a search party find R.W.G. Welling? Have you seen the name of Fulton McMahon or McMahon Fulton? I ain't sure which in the papers lately. Or Preble Tucker. But it's no use to go through the list of the reformers who said they sounded in the death knell of Tammany in 1894. They're gone for good, and Tammany's pretty well, thank you. They did the talking and posing, and the politicians in the movement got all the plums. It's always the case. The Citizens' Union has lasted a little bit longer than the reform crowd that went before them, but that's because they learned a thing or two from us. They learned how to put up a pretty good bluff, and bluff counts a lot in politics. With only a few thousand members, they had the nerve to run the whole fusion movement, make the Republicans and other organizations come to their headquarters to select a ticket, and dictate what every candidate must do or not do. I love nerve, and I've had a lot of respect for the Citizens' Union lately. But the union can't last. Its people haven't been trained to politics, and whenever Tammany calls their bluff, they lay right down. You'll never hear of the union again after a year or two. And by the way, what's become of the good government clubs, the political nurseries of a few years ago? Do you ever hear of good government club D and P and Q and Z any more? What's become of the infants who were to grow up and show us how to govern the city? I know what's become of the nursery that was started out in my district. You can find pretty much the whole outfit over at my headquarters, Washington Hall. The fact is that a reformer can't last in politics. He can make a show for a while, but he always comes down like a rocket. Politics is as much a regular business as the grocery or the dry goods or the drug business. You've got to be trained up to it, or you're sure to fail. Suppose a man who knew nothing about the grocery trade suddenly went into the business and tried to conduct it according to his own ideas. Wouldn't he make a mess of it? He might make a splurge for a while, as long as money lasted, but his store would soon be empty. It's just the same with the reformer. He hasn't been brought up in the difficult business of politics, and he makes a mess of it every time. I've been studying the political game for 45 years, and I don't know it all yet. I'm learning something all the time. How, then, can you expect what they call businessmen to turn into politics all at once and make a success of it? It is just as if I went up to Columbia University and started to teach Greek. They usually last about as long in politics as I would last at Columbia. You can't begin too early in politics if you want to succeed at the game. I began several years before I could vote, and so did every successful leader in Tammany Hall. When I was 12 years old, I made myself useful around the district headquarters and did work at all the polls on election day. Later on, I hustled about, getting out voters who had jags on or who were too lazy to come to the polls. There's 100 ways that boys can help, and they get an experience that's the first real step in statesmanship. Show me a boy that hustles for the organization on election day, and I'll show you a comin' statesman. That's the ABC of politics. It ain't easy work to get up to Q and Z. You have to give nearly all your time and attention to it. Of course, you may have some business or occupation on the side, but the great business of your life must be politics if you want to succeed at it. A few years ago, Tammany tried to mix politics and business in equal quantities by having 2 leaders for each district, a politician and a businessman. They wouldn't mix. They were like oil and water. The politician looked after the politics of his district. The businessman looked after his grocery store or his milk route, and whenever he appeared at an executive meeting, it was only to make trouble. The whole scheme turned out to be a farce, and was abandoned mighty quick. Do you understand now why it is that a reformer goes down and out in the first or second round, while a politician answers to the gong every time? It is because the one has gone into the fight without training, while the other trains all the time and knows every fine point of the game. End of chapter 4.